Hey guys, so in this video we're going to be talking about data types for variables, as well as taking in user input in Python. So first let's talk about data types in Python. And essentially a data type or data types are a way for Python to know what kind of data a variable is storing. And so today we're going to be talking about three very important and fundamental data types in Python. And these are text types, one text type, and two numeric types. And so in the beginning of Python, these are pretty much all we need to know so far. Now, before we jump into learning about data types and taking in user input, as of now, whenever we wanted to print any number, um, we're not just going to do what we've been doing since this IDLE shell is automatically printing it for us. So for example, if we wanted to say 45, every time we click enter, it'll print it automatically for us. And if we said num is equal to 45, and then we just typed num, it'll print 45 or whatever the variable or the number in 45 is. And so now what we're going to do is we're going to use a simple function called print. And this print function is basically just going to actually print it to the screen. So if I print num like this, it'll work perfectly fine, right? And this is basically more standard, more universal for Python because, writing num here and printing it out is only exclusive to Python shells. So we need to actually use this print function now. Okay, so first let's talk about the two numeric types because we've kind of already seen them already. And when I mean numeric type, I basically just mean numbers. All right, and these two numeric types are number one called int, and the second one is called float. So we have int and float. Now, with ints or integers, so class int, these are pretty much whole numbers from negative infinity all the way to infinity. So we can have, for example, negative 5, that's an int. We can have 45, that's an int. We can have 0, that is an integer. Some really large number, some really small number. And these are pretty much, integers because they're whole numbers. These are the counting numbers usually. All right, so now let's talk about floats, or as we call them, floating point numbers. And these are pretty much called decimal numbers as well. So these are any number with a decimal point, and any number with a decimal point is going to be a float. So for example, 45.3, that is a float. 3.14, that's a float, and so on. Any number with a point whatever is going to be a float. Okay, so now let's talk about some examples of numbers and determine whether or not they are whether they're ints or floats. And we can actually confirm our answer using a function called type. Type. And this function will basically return or print out, or actually it will return, a either int or float based on what we put into the type. So let's say we wanted to put 45. You can see that it's going to give me class int. And remember, we're going to be using print from now on. So let's say we want to print, for example, what is the type of 3.14? Well, obviously this should give me float. All right, so now let's first, number one, check whether or not 45 is an int or a float. Well, we already did that, right? So we already said that was an int because this is a whole number. Let's check whether or not 3.14 is a float. Well, we just checked it right here. So we can already see that 3.14 is indeed a float. Now let's do some little trickier ones. So what if I gave you the number 4.0? Well, you might be tempted to think that this is an int because it's a whole number, but because there's the 0.0 there, it's actually a float. If we wanted the whole number, we can just write 4. And this will give me int. So looking at the pattern here, any number with a decimal portion is a floating point number, and any whole number is an integer. And just like I mentioned in the last video, we can do all kinds of math operations on these numbers. So we can, add them together, we can subtract them, divide them, we can divide them rounding down. Remember, if we had 18 divided by 4, we get 4.5, but if I did 18//4, it'll give me 4. We can multiply two numbers together, and then we can also raise them to a certain power. And that's using double asterisks like this. We can also store variables, or we can store these numbers in variables as well. So let's say I've had, for example, meatball is equal to 2. And let's say I had salad is equal to 4.0. Well, what's going to happen here is what happens if I type print meatball to the power of salad. Well, you can see that I get 16.0 because 2 to the power of 4 is 16.0, right? Especially since we're using these right here. So whenever we use a floating point number, everything gets converted to a floating point number. But let's say I said salad is just equal to 4, and I printed meatball to the power of salad. See, now it just gives me regular 16, whole number 16 without any 0.0. So whenever we do any operations with decimal numbers, everything's going to get converted to a decimal number. So if you ever wondered what meatball to the power of salad is, there you go. All right, so now that we know about, these ints and floats, basically called numeric types, now let's talk about text types, or as programmers call them, strings. So they're called strings. So strings or string. All right, so a string is basically text in computer programming, and it could be, for example, a name, a sentence, a word, a character, all that kind of stuff. So whenever we use a string, we need to include something between it, either single quotes or double quotes. So for example, if we just tried writing Python is awesome, well, that's going to give me some errors, right? Basically, Python is not defined. It basically thinks that Python is a variable, awesome is a variable, and so on. And that's not what we actually want. So on the screen, it's going to give us an error right here. You can see name error, blah, blah, blah is not defined. And what we need to do is we need to include quotation marks around it. So for example, we can double quotes here, Python is awesome. And there we go. So we can see Python is awesome. And once again, we can use double quotes or single quotes. So if I use single quotes, you can see here, Python is awesome. And if I use double quotes, it also gives me the same thing. So Python is awesome. So with strings, we can also store them in variables as well, just like numbers. So remember we did meatball is equal to 2, salad is equal to 4.0. Well, we can do the exact same thing with strings. So we can say first name is equal to, for example, James. And let's say last name is equal to Bond. And actually, I'm going to use single quotes for Bond just to show you guys that it works as well. And once again, just like we did earlier with all these kind of numbers, we can do print first name plus last name. So you can see here that it gives me James Bond. And one thing that you should notice that, or keep in mind that I did, was I added a space right after James so that when I added the two strings together, or actually the correct term when you add two strings together, is called concatenate. So concatenate. And basically, this is a term for adding two strings together. So there's that. So one thing that's pretty important in Python is the idea of dynamic typing. So I'll write it out here, dynamic typing. And maybe I'll print it out for you guys too. So we're going to say, print dynamic typing. And what this means is, no, it doesn't mean, typing as in typing on the keyboard, what it actually means is data typing. So it's dynamic data types. And what that means is that the type of a variable, so for example, this meatball right now is of type int. So if I do type of meatball, it's going to give me int. And dynamic typing actually allows me to change this meatball into a string as well. So just to confirm something with you guys, let's say, what is the type of Python is awesome? And this is going to give me str, basically a string. So you can see meatball is an int and Python is awesome is a string. Now, one thing, once again, like I said, is a variable in Python doesn't always have to be the same data type throughout. It can change to an int, a string, and a float. So let's say, for example, we had num is equal to 45. And if we just printed out its type like this, we expect to get a int. And that's exactly what we get. So now let's say we said num is equal to 45 and see that we're changing the value of the same variable num. And if we run this and we say, print type of num now, we can see that now it's changed to a string, so an str. So you can see here that, the type in Python is dynamic. All right, so now let's talk about a function called input in Python. And the way we write it is we just write input like this. So whenever a user enters something from the keyboard, the input function will actually fetch it to your program. So if we run this right now, it's actually going to prompt us. So the computer's going to ask us, the user, for some input. So if I just write, hello, for example, then hello will be inputted like that. But input as itself right now is actually pretty useless. So to actually make use of it, we're actually going to store it into a variable. So what we're going to do is say, for example, fish is equal to input. And what this means is whatever we would take an input here, fish is equal to that, right? Create some space in memory for fish, and then take in the input and store that in the location of fish. So what we're going to do is we're going to say, take in the input, and let's say we wanted tuna. Well, now, if we actually print out the fish, you can see that, print tuna, fish. We can see that we get tuna, like that. Okay, so now the input function actually takes something in as a parameter. So you can see that it's, kind of empty here right now, where it has, these parentheses and it's pretty empty inside. And one thing that we can actually do is we can actually insert a string into between these parentheses. So let's say, for example, we wanted to, ask the user for their name. So we can say name is equal to input, and we're actually going to put in a string here. So let's say we wanted to ask the user for some input. So we might say, please enter a name, for example, or your name. And if we do this, it's going to say, please enter your name like this. It's actually going to print it out, not the fake print, but it's actually going to print it out. And what's going to happen is if I put my name here, so if I say, James Bond, then now if I printed out the name, it's going to print out James Bond. All right, cool. So the computer will ask the user for something, and if nothing is input, the computer will just keep waiting. And once the user hits enter, so that enter button on your keyboard, the computer will store the input in the name location in memory now. But one issue with this input function is it's actually of type string. So if I look at, for example, if I say num is equal to, for example, input, please enter a number. And if I put in a number like 5, let's actually check out what type of data is being stored in num. So if we, once again, print type of num, then we expect a int, but actually we're going to get a string. So one way to combat this issue is we need to convert the string to an integer. And we can actually do this. So all we have to do is say num is equal to int. So we type int like this, the type we want, and then we're going to write the string here. So for example, we can write 5, and then if we check the type of num now, it's going to give us int. So you can see that we converted a string to an int. Now this only works if the number inside is purely a number. So if we have any letters in there, it's not going to work, right? So if we write int, 5 and then hello, that's not going to work. It's going to give us an error. All right, cool. So now you know how to convert a string into an int. So now to wrap this all together, if I wanted to take in an integer as input, all I have to do is convert the input, like so, into a string. So now I can ask, please enter a number. And you can see that the input here is actually a string, but we're going to convert it to an integer and then store it into num. So please enter a number, let's say 60. And then if we print num, we get 60. And then if we print the type of num, then we get int here. So converting can go many ways as well. So if we wanted to go from int to a string, we might do something like num is equal to str. So that's the data type that we want. And then whatever we put inside. So like that. And now the type of num is going to be string now. So if I type print the type of, the type of num, we expect string, like so. We can go from float to string as well. So we can say num is equal to str of 3.14. And if we print out the type of num, we get string as well. And we can obviously go from string to float now too. So we can say num is equal to the floating, to the floating point number of, for example, 3.14. And if we print the type of this num, we get float, just as we expected. All right, so there's pretty much that. And we converted from float to string, string to float, and int to string. And just like we did earlier, we can go from string to int as well. Okay, so now let's jump into Turtle and see how we can actually use this. So let's say we had the Turtle open, and this is the code from the previous video. And we wanted to, say this was 100, right? So if this was 100 before, I actually wanted to, specify exactly how much I wanted to run it. So if we run this actually, and let's see, so save this, we run the shell like so. Let's see. Oh, it seems to not be running. Let's reopen this. So we're gonna file, open, and we're going to go to local disk, users, and we're going to go to Bob the Awesome Turtle. So we can see here, if we run this module, you can see that it goes something like this. So it goes down by 100 and then to the left by 100. But let's say I want to specify from the user standpoint how much I want to, move. Well, I can say input, please enter how much Bob will paint. And if we write this, there actually is already an issue with this. If we run this, right, let's save it, run it. And, Bob is going to be there, but he's going to ask, please enter how much Bob will paint. So we're going to write 5, or let's say 150, right? Well, we can see that this is giving us an error. And we can already kind of expect how this error will take place. The reason this error takes place already, and let me close this one here. The reason the error takes place here is simply because this, once again, is of type string. So to convert this to an integer or a float or whatever you want, we can actually do that by simply typing int like that. So now the input is converted to an integer. So if we run this module, please enter how much bulb will paint, let's say 150, then we can see that it works perfectly fine. All right, so now let's try some more, complex, a little more complex programs as well. So let's say, for example, let's create a new file. So let's close out of this turtle, a new file, and let's say we had a program that asked us, what is the height, what is the base of the triangle, and what is the height of the triangle? And I wanted to calculate the area based off of that. Well, the question is, what is the area of the triangle? We know that the area of a triangle is equal to base times height divided by 2, right? And so what we can do is we can say base is equal to the int. So you have to convert the input to an int. And let's say the computer asked us, please enter the length of the base. So please enter the length of the triangle base. And then let's say it asked us, what is the height? So it's going to say height equals int of the input. And let's say, please enter the height of the triangle. And from there, what we're going to do is we're going to say the area, some variable area, is equal to base, and we're going to say in brackets, remember the brackets, base times height divided by 2. So if we write area is equal to base times height divided by 2, we have our area now. And let's say, for example, we wanted to print this out. So we wanted to say area is, area, like that. Now, there's actually one issue with this. And the issue with this is that we can't add a string and a number together. So what we're going to have to do, and if I even run this, so first let's save it. So let's save it in my users. Let's say area of triangle. And if I actually ran this, let's see what's going to happen. So if I say, the base of my triangle was, let's say 6, and the height was equal to 2. Well, you can see that we have an error here. It says type error, can only concatenate string, not float to string. And so what we actually need to do here is convert the area to a string when we print it out. So now let's save it and let's run the module. So we can say, what is the area of the base? 6. And what is the height of the triangle? 2. We expect an area of 6. So we can see the area is 6.0. Awesome. So that's pretty much how we can get the area of a triangle if we ask the user for the base and the height. Next, let's try out another program that says, take in 2 numbers and then output them in the form of a plus b is equal to c. So for example, if we took in the numbers 5 or let's say 2 and 3, then I want to output a string that looks like this. 2 plus 3 is equal to 5. And this is pretty easy to do. So all I have to do is say a is equal to the int of the input. Please enter the first number. And then let's say b is equal to the int of the input. Please enter the second number. So please enter the second number. And then what I can do is I can store the result of a plus b in a variable c. So we can say a plus b. And then finally, to print it out, all I have to do is say a plus some string plus like this, b, and then equals c. Now, once again, there's an issue with this, and that's we can't add strings and numeric types together. So what we have to do is we need to actually wrap this around something like this. So we're going to wrap this around and convert the numbers into strings so that they can actually be printed out properly. So if we run this module, we can see 2, 3, and then we get an output of 2 plus 3 is equal to 5. All right, so in this video, you learned about Python data types, taking an input, and then also converting the idea of dynamic types in Python into actual code.